Yep. Good morning. I'm Denise Graves. I'm glad you're with us on this overcast spring day. If you are a visitor, we are especially glad to have you here. Let's begin by lighting our chalice. Karen is in our sanctuary. For every time we make a mistake and we decide to start again, we light this chalice. For every time we are lonely and we let someone be our friend, we light this chalice. For every time we are disappointed and we choose hope, we light this chalice. Welcome. We're pleased to have as our speaker today, Vanderbilt professor Amy Jill Levine, who has been a good friend to this congregation for a long time. We will hear from her shortly as she speaks to us about the Bible passage, "Blessed are those who mourn." Our online services run more smoothly each time, but just in case there is a glitch, please note that someone is working to quickly correct it. Also remember that this service can later be accessed by YouTube video. You can also get resources and support from our website. This congregation has a covenant, which is a promise that we make to each other and to ourselves. Please join me in saying the words of our covenant. We covenant together to make a welcoming community, to walk together in the way of truth and love, to seek the life of the Spirit as it is known by each person, to support each other in thought, word, and deed as we work to build a better world. Let's listen together as Tina and Amelie sing the Beatles song, "Let It Be." I guess we lost the sound on that. Maybe we can get back to it later.
When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. And in my hour of darkness, she is standing right in front of me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be. Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. Whisper words of wisdom, let it be. And when the broken-hearted people living in the world agree, there will be an answer, let it be. For though they may be parted, there is still a chance that they may see. There will be an answer, let it be. Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. There will be an answer, let it be. Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. Whisper words of wisdom, let it be.
Thank you so much. That has been a beloved song for many, many years for many of us. This is our time for All Sages. This means that we will share something of interest to people of all ages. Our Soul Matters theme for this month is liberation. With liberation in mind, let's watch this short video titled Stuck on an Escalator.
Whoa, that's not good.
Oh, I don't need this. I'm already late.
Somebody will come. Anybody out there?
Do you have a phone?
No. Sorry. Somebody! Hello? There are two people stuck on an escalator and we need help. Now, would somebody please do something? I don't believe this. You gotta be kidding me.
I'm gonna cry.
Well, there's not enough left to do, is there?
Hello? Hey, don't worry about it. I'll fix it in a second.
He said he can fix it. All right. All right. That's more like it. He says he can fix it.
Walking down the sidewalk, kicking my feet as I move to the music. Step to the beat. I woke up today, canceled all my plans, and I stepped right outside with my guitar in my hands, and the notes became loud as the sound caressed the air, and I kicked it up a notch as I strolled without a care, 'cause I'm going down the road to a brand new place, and I'll get there with a smile.
I hope that people of all ages are reminded that we often already have the means to liberate ourselves, a way to get unstuck. Sometimes the key is to break a pattern, do something in a new way. In other words, sometimes you just got to walk right off that escalator. Now it's time for our offering. It takes money to make things happen. Each month we have a Share the Plate partner so that we can make things happen, not only in our congregation, but also make things happen in our larger community. This month, our Share the Plate partner is Gideon's Army. This is an organization that focuses on dismantling the school to prison pipeline. There is more information about Gideon's Army on our website. We have 3 ways to make an offering. We can go to the GNUUC website and click Donate. We can mail a check to 374 Hicks Road, or we can text 615-246-5553. Let's pause for a moment to do that. Let's sit quietly together as we hear our words for meditation and then a time of silence. Lila Watson tells us, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let's work together.
Ashivenu, Ashivenu, Adonai Elicha, Venu Shuva, Venu Chodesh, Chodesh, Yaminu
Now it's time to welcome our speaker, Vanderbilt Professor Amy Jill Levine. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm happy to be with you. I'm trusting you can hear me okay. Good. It's so nice to see you. I've missed you guys so much. That's fabulous. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to talk about something called a beatitude, and we'll go over what those are. And the specific beatitude that we're talking about is blessed are those who mourn. Not a happy subject, but not necessarily a depressing one. And I've been thinking about it recently because I've lost a couple of friends to this dreadful virus, and a few are quite ill. So I've been thinking about how do we mourn when we can't be together, and what does mourning look like, and where do we find comfort? I've also been working on the Sermon on the Mount. So with any luck, the share screen will work, and we'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of a talk back. So here we go. If I can get onto my screen, we are good. I'm trusting you can see this. It says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. It's part of the Sermon on the Mount, and it's quite near the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, as you can see. It's the fourth line through. So here we are. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is set up as if he's a new Moses. In the Christmas story, he survives when children all around him are killed by King Herod the Great soldiers. He goes to Egypt. He comes out of Egypt. And then Matthew positions him after 40 days in the wilderness to go up on a mountaintop. And everybody who's familiar with Torah, with what the church would eventually call the Old Testament, says, oh, this looks like Moses going through the wilderness and then going up on top of the mountain. The point is not to do away with Torah. The point is to interpret it, because all texts require interpretation. And that's particularly the case with the law code. So we have a law code, and then we have to decide, well, under new circumstances or different exigencies, do we change the law? When do we agree with the law? When do we protest against it? And so on. In this case, he's not speaking to the general crowd, although they're listening in. We find that at the end. But he's actually speaking to the insiders. So he sees the crowds and he goes up on the mountain, perhaps to get away from them, perhaps not. He sits down. And for all the commentators that say he sits down because rabbis teach when they sit, that's nonsense. Rabbis teach whenever they can. He sits down because he's about to talk for 3 chapters, and he's practical. His disciples come to him, so we're listening in as if we're disciples, and he begins to teach them. Those are the first 2 verses of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus probably never actually gave. It's basically a collection of Jesus' greatest hits. There's a document in the Mishnah, this compendium of rabbinic law, which is actually the rabbi's greatest hits. We can find many passages in the Sermon on the Mount strewn throughout the other Gospels. And I think Matthew, who likes to collect things in major discourses, thought, I'm going to front load the Gospel with what I think are the most important teaching. And therefore, as we follow out the rest of the Gospel, we'll have the Sermon on the Mount echoing in the back, saying, here's how you interpret this stuff. And from the Sermon on the Mount, even if you're unfamiliar with the New Testament, I think it's my job as a Jew to bring the New Testament to Unitarians, among other things. These are phrases that you would have heard before. The 3rd verse in the Sermon on the Mount, the beginning of the teaching, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The Gospel of Luke has instead, blessed are you poor. We've got extensions like, you have heard it said to people of old, I say to you, don't murder. But Jesus says, but I say to you, if you're angry with a brother or sister, you're already guilty. This is where we get things like turn the other cheek and go the extra mile and give somebody the shirt off your back. It's where the golden rule is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's where we get famous comments like, don't cast pearls before swine, and so on. Would it be odd that Matthew would have collected these sayings? Not at all. We see the rabbis doing it. We also see in classical scholarship, people collecting basically Homer's greatest hits and Julius Caesar's greatest hits, and so on. The term beatitude itself comes from the Latin for blessed are. The New Testament is written in Greek, and the Greek word that begins all these blessed are's is makarios, or makarioi, plural blessed. I had one student, I was trying to define to them that sometimes they're called macarisms. And one of my students, God bless the student, said, you mean like macaroons? And I said, no, it has nothing to do with macaroons. Makarios is blessed. There are 8 of these blessings in the Sermon on the Mount. And this type of blessing is found throughout Israel's scriptures, whether the Jewish Tanakh or the Christian Old Testament, and into rabbinic literature. For those of you who have Jewish background or Jewish friends or experiences in synagogues, you will know that many prayers begin Baruch. It's where the name Barak comes from, by the way, that's the Arabic. Baruch is to bless. So Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, O Lord our God. But there's another form of beatitude or macarisms in the Hebrew, which begins Ashrei, which means happy or fortunate. For those of you, the name Asher is actually a cognate of Ashrei. So the name Asher basically means happy one. How do we translate the Beatitudes? Blessed are makes sense, but some translations will read happy are. I'm not sure happy are those who mourn is a correct translation. I think it's probably problematic. Fortunate are, praiseworthy are, and some people even want to read this congratulations or good on you, as they would say in Australia. Sounds like mazel tov. But I think from the Latin Beatitudes, the blessed are is probably the best translation here, because it has a sense not only of human relationships, but when we talk about people being blessed, for a number of people that has a more spiritual or divine orientation. And I think that's what Matthew is trying to convey. There are a number of these macarisms, beatitudes in the Old Testament, the scriptures of Israel. So I just gave you a couple of examples. Jeremiah 17:7 is just a handy dandy repeat. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord, whose trust is in the Lord. For those of you interested in ecology, and it was so nice to see the shot of the garden from the church. Blessed are those who trust in the Lord. They shall be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by the stream. In a year of drought, it is not anxious. I think that's nice. I like the idea of trees not being anxious. If a tree can manage, we can. Here's Isaiah 38. The Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all who wait for him. So there's the connection of, if you want justice, if you're waiting for justice, you're already blessed because your priorities are in the right place. From Psalm 118, a very famous passage that gets cited over and over again in the New Testament. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Or Isaiah 38, here using the term Ashrei, happy are all those who wait for him. Or Psalm 84, the Hebrew is Ashrei, the Greek is Makarioi, same as in the Sermon on the Mount. Happy are those who live in your house, ever singing your praise. Selah is a musical notation. So I was trying to look up Ashrei on the internet just to make sure I got the correct transliteration. because I'm thinking in Hebrew, but I figured I needed to put it in Greek. And I wound up with ASHRAE, the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. I thought, okay, they're blessed too, but sure, what you're going to do with that. So here are the familiar Beatitudes from Matthew. The first one, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Our text for today, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The next one is, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. That's a direct quote from a psalm, by the way. And they're not weird. So a number of my students say, oh, when Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, or blessed are those who are meek, that's completely countercultural. Because for my students, they value what's countercultural. In order to do that, they have to create a culture that's really, really awful so Jesus can look all bright and shiny. But that's not what's going on at all. There's nothing in these Beatitudes that's particularly weird. They don't introduce new ideas. They don't introduce a new theology. They don't introduce a new ethic. And we can see this in terms of the mourning by Isaiah chapter 61. And the cool thing here is in the Gospel of Luke, and this is a passage I've talked with you about. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus goes into a synagogue and they hand him the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and he begins to quote from Isaiah 61. So we actually have in another gospel, not Matthew, Jesus quoting this material. But here, what is the Spirit of the Lord supposed to do? It's supposed to comfort all those who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning. That's the same idea of he anoints my head with oil, my cup runs over, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. And here's the idea of why can you get out of mourning? Because there's actually a hope for the future. They'll build up the ancient ruins. They'll raise up former devastations. They'll repair the ruined city. Why? Because Isaiah is writing following the Babylonian exile. And he's writing to the people who have been into exile and then they've been repatriated back to the land of Israel, back to Judea. And they're looking at this total devastation. And Isaiah says, you know what? You can rebuild and you can have hope in that rebuilding. It's very, very communal in terms of these hopes. So there are alternative versions of the Beatitudes in the Gospel of Luke. Luke and Matthew share Beatitudes, but they tell them somewhat differently. It had been thought for a number of years that Luke and Matthew both had access to the same source, and Matthew spun it in one direction and Luke spun it in another. But having written a commentary on the Gospel of Luke, the more I looked at that shared material, the more I became convinced that Luke actually had a copy of Matthew and Luke changed things. Whether for better or for worse is another matter we don't have to discuss today. Here's Matthew. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Here's Luke. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. It's the same beatitude in the same structural place, but it looks like Luke has changed mourning to weeping and be comforted to laughing. And then Luke adds woes. Matthew doesn't have any woes. The Sermon on the Mount gives you everything right at the beginning, and then at the end tells you you need to be perfect. Okay, but it starts off well. Luke adds a woe. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. And actually, I don't like that verse. One of the cool things about being any reader of the Bible, you can look at a text and say, you know what, I don't like that text. And then you can wrestle with the text. That's what to be Israel means. I don't like Luke's woe because I don't think we should take comfort when other people weep and mourn. Your enemy falls on a banana peel and you laugh. I don't think so. Your enemy is injured. I don't think you should be laughing at that either. I don't think we take comfort then. Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount, just a couple of verses after our Beatitude says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I don't think taking comfort in the tragedies that strike our enemies is terribly helpful or loving of enemies. But we're back to Matthew. So here we are. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Matthew chapter 5 is not the first time Matthew has hinted of this. Matthew, like many books in the New Testament, in fact, like most books in the New Testament, will cite the earlier scriptures of Israel. And when it does, it expects you to be able to fill in the blanks. It expects you, the reader familiar with the anterior text, to say, oh, I know what the next verse is. I know what the next verse is. It's like presuming people still have a knowledge of English literature. I was an English major and I despair these days that people don't read the same canon that I did. If you say to be or not to be, pretty much everybody over 30 knows that's Hamlet and you fill in the rest. Today, I'm not so sure what they know. For they will be comforted. Back in Matthew chapter 2, the Christmas story, Herod sends out his soldiers. They murder all the children of Bethlehem. Baby Jesus, along with his parents, escape to Egypt. And then Matthew throws in what's called a fulfillment citation, because Matthew likes to footnote everything. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation. This is mourning. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. The babies are dead. It's a direct quote from Jeremiah chapter 31. Except the next verse in Jeremiah says, stop your weeping. In other words, the next verse says, I know you're in mourning now, but take comfort. Jeremiah is actually talking about, again, the Babylonian exile. And when the exiled people left the land of Israel and went to Babylon, they would have passed by Ramah, which is to the east of Jerusalem. And that's where Rachel is buried. So technically, we can imagine Rachel in her grave watching the exiles being taken into Babylon. And Jeremiah says, stop weeping, telling Rachel, your eyes no longer have to cry because your children will come home. So what Matthew has already done by giving us this scene in chapter 2 is when we get to blessed are those who mourn, we already know from Jeremiah that mourning is not the end. Mourning is a process and it is necessary, but it's not the end of the story. Matthew also suggests that people will mourn for Jesus. This is Matthew 9:15. Jesus typically calls himself a bridegroom, and his followers are therefore guests at a wedding. And he says, listen, you guys, we're at a wedding right now, turning water into wine and all that good stuff. You can't mourn now, but the time will come when I will no longer be here. And then you can mourn and you can fast. But since Christians proclaim a resurrection, they also know that that mourning period will end. Some Christian theologians, including the former Pope Benedict, see the Beatitudes as Jesus' autobiography. He's talking about himself. He's poor in spirit. He mourns over the city of Jerusalem. He hungers and thirsts for righteousness and all that. I don't think that's how Jesus followers initially would have heard the Beatitudes. I certainly don't think it's how the disciples hearing the Macarisms would have said, oh, this must be Jesus' autobiography. Because they don't understand him to be talking about himself. They understand him to be talking about communal living, personal ethic, church-based ethics. He's talking about the human condition. And here theology and ethics are not mutually exclusive. So when you say blessed are those who mourn, it doesn't help to walk into a house of mourning or to call somebody who's just lost somebody and say, hey, blessed are you. That's not terribly helpful. Comments like, I'm sure she's in a better place is not terribly helpful. It certainly doesn't comfort them. It doesn't comfort me when I think I don't care where that person is. I want that person here with me. So that's not comforting. God brings home the one God loves, suggests that those of us who are left behind are chopped liver, and that's not terribly helpful. I have heard in Christian funerals, heaven needs another angel, to which my general thought is, really? I think there are plenty up there, and I could use the person right here. Or everything happens for a reason. Well, this virus doesn't. And trying to find an explanation for the death of a loved one, it doesn't help. Scientifically, we should do that, but justifying somebody's death by explanation, it gets us nowhere. It doesn't provide comfort. And since we're on Job, one of Job's friends actually gives him a Macarism. How happy, here's Ashrei happy, is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. In other words, you've been blessed because God is punishing you because of your sins. But that doesn't work for Job. He's lost his children, he's lost his wife, he's lost his house, he's lost all of his money, his body is riddled with disease, and he's sitting on top of an ash heap, scratching his sores with a potsherd. He's not feeling terribly blessed under the circumstances. And for somebody to say to someone in such a circumstance, yeah, you should be happy because God's simply testing you here, I think is disgusting theology. Indeed, at the end of the book of Job, God sides with Job against his friends because Job doesn't answer the question of why bad things happen to good people. In fact, it thwarts any easy answer. I think if suffering makes us happy, we're not suffering. And if suffering is excused, we're not human. So what do we learn from all this? Blessed are you who mourn now because you will be comforted. Well, the first point is that those who mourn are blessed because not everybody can mourn. Not everybody has had the opportunity of saying, I love this person and I desperately miss this person. A heart that knows how to grieve is a heart that knew how to love. Right? I know some people who, somebody dies and they say, well, that's too bad, but we have work to do, or let's go on. To mourn, I mean, really to mourn is to know that you love, and that's helpful. Being able to mourn also means being able to take the time to mourn, and so to do it according to our own timetable. In our current society, in a number of cases, mourning is considered a luxury. You don't have time to mourn, you got to get with the program, got to get the work done. In the Jewish tradition, we do something called sitting Shiva. Shiva means 7, and the idea is that after a person dies, you go to that person's home or the home of a relative, a spouse, a child, and you visit the mourners and you bring them comfort. You actually get an example of this in John chapter 11, which is the story of a fellow named Lazarus who's dead, and his sisters Mary and Martha are actually mourning for him. And the text says even the Jews knew how came to worship and to mourn with Mary and Martha. So mourning means taking the time to do it, and it also means being able to do it in community. The Kaddish prayer, which some of you may be familiar with, is also a memorial prayer. And in Judaism, you can't say this memorial prayer unless you have a quorum of 10 people, or in the Orthodox synagogue, a quorum of 10 males over the age of 13. The Kaddish prayer in Aramaic begins, magnified and sanctified be the name of God, which sounds kind of like hallowed be your name. It's a prayer that doesn't have anything to do with death. It's a prayer that says, in the context of mourning, there's still an opportunity to praise God. There's still an anchor somewhere. And for those people who have some sort of theological belief, this can also be a comfort. Why 7 days? I just threw this in because sometimes people ask. Genesis chapter 7 says, after 7 days, the waters of the flood came on the earth. So it took a while. The French medieval Jewish commentator Rashi says, why 7 days? Because they were mourning for Methuselah, who lived like 969 years. And the message here is death comes to everybody and everybody deserves to be mourned. Other explanations, Joseph in Egypt observed for his father Jacob a mourning period of 7 days, and Job's friends sit with him 7 days. But what else do we learn from this beatitude, blessed are those who mourn? We've already seen from Isaiah 61 that God comforts the mourners in Zion by telling them that theirs is not the last generation, that what they may not see to fruition, their children and their children's children will. To mourn in Israel means we are not alone. We not only have our friends and our relatives, we have the previous generations and the generations to come. So mourning is a communal thing. And once you know that that community is there and supporting you, you can generally take comfort in that. In the Jewish tradition, it's also appropriate to say, not, God needs another angel. Jews don't run around saying something like that. But you enter a house of mourning where people are sitting Shiva, and you say, may you be comforted among the mourners in Zion. But you also say, may that person's memory, may the deceased memory be for a blessing. In other words, no matter what a schmuck the dead person was, if you cared about that person, you remembered the good stuff. And you tell stories about that person. And in telling the stories and sitting there with the family and the friends and telling these stories, the memory does become a blessing. When I was a kid, my father died when I was quite young, and I'm an only child. And I remember when we were sitting Shiva at our house, friends of my parents would come to me and they would say things like, well, Amy Jill, you know that your actions should bring honor to your father, and what you do, that says something about how you were raised, and that says something about him. So I was 13 and I was mature enough to get the point. How do you make somebody's memory be for a blessing? Because if you carry that person in your heart, whatever you do becomes a blessing to that person. And when you recall that person's words and they motivate you toward good action or toward artistic development or to inspiration of some sort, that person's memory becomes a blessing. If you are a child, you carry your parents with you. There's nothing you can do about that. And no matter what sort of strained relationship or good relationship you have, whatever you do, your actions impact that person's memory. And that's why I so hope my kids still like me. So far, it's working pretty well. So whenever I act, I think, what would my mother think? What would my father think? And how can my actions bring blessing to those memories? And in that very thought, I can think, boy, my mother would be really proud of that article I just wrote, or my mother would be really proud that, I actually got the dishes done. That would be for a blessing. And what do we do? Because for mourners to be comforted, it's not just people come to us, it's what we do ourselves. So what do we do in the memory of those who are no longer with us in the body? How do we keep that memory alive? How do we honor the dead? And in those very actions we perform, we receive comfort. And here, GNUUC, actually your building, has this model for me. So I'm picturing, you keep changing where the furniture is, so you never quite know where the front is. But you know that wonderful mural you have with all the symbols of all the different religions on it, and there's this swirl there? After Eva Tauster died, I kept, and some of you will remember Eva, I kept looking at that swirl and I thought, that reminds me of Eva's bun, because she always had this gray bun with these little hairs floating up. And then I kept looking at this picture and I kept seeing other members of the congregation who are no longer with us. And I've been with your congregation for about 20 years. And every time we lose a member, most recently, I think of Dan Rosemurgy, I look up at that mural and I think, oh, there's Dan, and there's Oscar, and there's Eva, and there's Carl, and there are all these other people up there. So that whenever I look at that mural, it has nothing originally to do with any of these people, but I'm able to hold their memory in that art. So that whenever I walk into your building, and now because I can't walk into your building, whenever I picture it, and I was picturing it when I was putting these slides together, whenever I picture it, I get a sense of, oh, that's how I understand this this church. That's how I understand. Let's get out of the share here. You can probably see my website now. That's how I understand you all. That's how I hold memory. I think Denise is with us, and we were talking to, as we were putting this talk together, about the memories that you share. And Denise actually shared one with me. If you're here and you'd be willing to share that, that would be a nice way of beginning just a very brief talk back.
Okay, thank you so much. Am I on yet?
You are.
All right, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about. And I'm thinking that what you were referring to, I'll explain it very quickly and then we'll go forward with our questions and answers. We've heard a lot about liberation. We've heard a lot about mourning. And right now we are mourning the losses of the coronavirus, lost lives, most importantly, jobs lost, homes lost, and the expectation of how we would be living right now has been lost. As we work through our grief, including times of denial and anger, we know that when we reach acceptance, we will find hope. It will be a liberation. Mm-hmm. And now Jesse will facilitate a question and answer session for us.
Thank you very much, Denise, and thank you so much, AJ. If you would like to ask a question of AJ, ask for you to raise your hand. If you are on a computer or on a screen, if you can go ahead and share your video so I can see you waving. After we take a number of questions, what I'll do is I'll open up the phone lines as well so you can ask questions as well. The first person that I see is Larry. Larry, go ahead.
Yes.
Hi, Larry.
Howdy. I was wondering about, as we talked about comforting, sometimes I see people in loss and they don't want to be comforted, but they may accept you just sitting there and maybe touching their arm, which is paradoxically still a form of comforting. But it's people have to comfort at their level, and I found out there's very little, when you really have to comfort grief, there's very little you can say. And my usual long-winded way is not helpful. You don't do that. If they say something and they have questions, okay, but just the simplicity of being there.
Yeah. Just let me respond to that because it's such a good point. It's actually a biblical point. The beginning of Job, when Job is in this terrible shape, his friends come and they sit with him in silence for 7 days. You don't have to say anything. And in fact, when they open their mouths is when they get into trouble because they're trying to justify his situation. There's no way they can do that. So the Bible already says, sit in silence. I know you're here, and I, the morning person, if I need something, I'll let you know. But you know what? I'm really happy to have your presence here, right? And you're right, people mourn in different ways. And some people don't mourn right away. Sometimes it will take them a week or a month, and then suddenly, slam, it hits them. You never know.
Thank you. Thina.
So thank you very much for this. It brings me great comfort to
It's so good to see you.
Hi. See you. It's so good to see you. One of the things that came up for me was when I am in mourning, I really can't stand the platitudes. You
Yeah.
know, you know, they died for a reason, and God wouldn't have given you something that you couldn't have handled, and all that. I can't stand that. Right, to me, that's more damaging than it is
Yeah.
healing. So to hear these words just gave me such comfort, and it helps me feel like, I get through it, and it's okay to mourn the way that we mourn, and to just let people be in their mourning. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for sharing this today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Love you. Love you.
I mean, I've been to a number of funerals at GNUUC, and I love the way that just as you do, as your congregation does, and people just get up and they tell stories. And individual memories, communal memories, stuff that people may not have known. And every time I've left a funeral there, I've had this kind of, wow, I feel better. I still miss the person dreadfully, but I feel better because I've been with other people who took the time to go to the funeral and had the courage to get up and share. And you guys do that really, really well.
Thank you. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask or to speak to the topic. Yes, Susan.
So I want to comment on the last word that Denise said, and that was acceptance. And I think that one of the problems we have is that sort of Kubler-Ross, you go through the sequence and then you've passed your morning test and you're in acceptance and
you're on a timetable to do it too, right?
And my medical students, there are multiple choice tests, questions based on that, and yet we have to remind them that this is not really the way people mourn, and I think that the idea of even annual memory anniversaries and things we've kind of removed from our society, but I don't know that acceptance is the state that we're in, and I wondered if you would comment on that.
Yeah, thanks for that. In theological education, we teach Kubler-Ross, and then we teach, and now here we are 40 years later. Right?
It's the same in medical ed now.
Right. I mean, you have to move on. So I talk to my students about Jewish mourning rites because I think they work pretty well. You sit Shiva for 7 days. You cover the mirrors, whether to keep the angel of death from bringing you through. It's kind of like Alice through the looking glass, but bad. Or because you don't want to be vain, so you don't want to look at yourself to make sure like your hair is in place. And after that, you have a 30-day period where you leave the house and you come into the synagogue, and then you have an 11-month period.
Yeah.
After which there's an unveiling, so you go to the cemetery and you see the gravestone or whatever the grave marker is, and after a year you kind of come back into life. So it's a process. But at the same time, every year on the anniversary of a loved one's death, we have something called Yahrzeit. It's, if you know German, Jahr is year and Zeit is time, so year time. And the Yahrzeit is the anniversary of the deceased death according to the Jewish calendar, which usually means, because we're on a lunar calendar, the synagogue has to tell you. And you go to the synagogue and there are all these memorial plaques in every synagogue. And if it's the week of a Yahrzeit, there's a little light by that person's name. So everybody who walks in sees that light, goes, oh, that's the anniversary of so-and-so's death. And it doesn't matter if the death was, 1850. You were a member of that congregation, that plaque is there and that light is on. The name is read aloud to the congregation, regardless of whether the person has any relatives left, that person was a member of the congregation. The name is read. If you're a direct relative or you're saying Kaddish for somebody else, because you can do this on behalf of somebody else. You go to the synagogue and you stand up and you say the Kaddish prayer and you acknowledge, yeah, my father died in 1970. I still go to the synagogue on the anniversary. Well, now I can't. On the anniversary of his death to say the Kaddish prayer. And now we do it by ourselves, but we in the Orthodox synagogue, we know what time in the service the prayer is said. So I can say it at that particular time. So it's helpful. So what have we done? We've turned death into an industry. Funerals are big industries, and we've saying, you get to mourn for 24 hours and then have done with it. You're still mourning after 30 days. What's wrong with you? Get with the program. And this goes back to Larry's concern about how different people mourn. It's helpful if doctors get that too. It's also helpful if medical personnel can take the time also to mourn, because they're not supposed to, and they have to, because otherwise they're going to burn out.
Now, that's one of the things we do is we give our students permission to have emotions and to be able to cry. I mean, we tell them, it shouldn't be you the center of attention, but you are allowed to cry.
Right.
And you're allowed to go to funerals, and you're allowed to have that humanity, because some of them feel like they have to put that barrier up.
Yeah.
So you have to show your strength, in order to be professional. And so
Clergy are
opening up.
right. Clergy are told exactly the same things. And that's why it helps to have a therapist. Or at least a good listener, or a circle where you can say, oh, that was a really bad week.
Well, and that community of mourning within the profession is also important for them.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Susan. Do we have others? Yes, so I see another Susan.
Hi, AJ.
Hi, nice to see you.
Really enjoyed your presentation today. I just wanted to share with regard to my mourning situation that I had was I lost my mother while I was in Germany, and I got this phone call at 11 a.m. there, and I knew that it was 3 a.m. here.
Yeah.
And so I realized that she was gone. And ever since then, the main thing that my mother always loved to do, this weekend coming up, her birthday was May the 4th, and she would actually be 112 this year if she were still alive. She lived to 104, but she always loved the Kentucky Derby so much. And it's always on the weekend of her birthday usually. And so I have always watched the Kentucky Derby for her every year until this year I can't. But I would always watch it, and I'd hold her picture watching the TV while I was watching the Derby with her.
Fabulous. That's fabulous. And I have a feeling that when the Kentucky Derby or the Preakness or the Belmont or whatever, they start running again, people on this video are now going to think, oh, there's a new memory. We have to go with that.
Yeah.
So tell the story, and the story will remain, and people will remember how fabulous.
Yeah, I think that's the fun thing about having memories of somebody, is to find the thing that you loved about them.
Mm-hmm.
And dwell on that.
Yep. I mean, if you can think of good things, that's fine. There will always be regrets. There will always be the I should have, I didn't do what I should have done. But we know that. Make it better after the fact if you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. Are there other questions or comments? Go and raise your hand if you'd like to speak. All right. Larry, okay. Larry, all right. Oh, and then Fran will get you. Fran will get you right after that. Go ahead, Larry.
Oh, I have this little thing. I had this friend of mine I loved. He died a few years ago. I remember my friend Udi fussed at me because I was making a peanut butter sandwich at his house, and I put a big glob of peanut butter, was still on the knife, into the sink, and he fussed at me about being wasteful. Now, when I'm scooping out my yogurt, I scrape it all out, lick the edge, and to myself I say, "See, Udi, I'm doing it good."
Nice. And Fran, let me go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead.
Hi, AJ.
Hey, Fran, I didn't know you were there. Hi.
I am here, and I am I have been so looking forward to getting to hear and see you today. So thank you for being willing to share with us in the format that we are forced to share with.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I look forward, I know with everyone else, to the time when we will be together in the building and you get to come back. I'll try to be very brief. I can relate to you, first of all, about the loss of your father. And I think maybe I have shared this with you before. I too am an only child and was a daddy's girl. And my father died when I was 26, so 46 years ago. And I can honestly say that I still think about him all the time because there are so many things to bring back memories. And most of my mourning with him today and in these last number of years has to do with all the things about my life or my children's lives that he didn't get to witness or be a part of. So anyway, but the other part I wanted to speak to was my beloved Carl. And first of all, it really warmed my heart when you said his name, when you were talking about.
I mean, he used to sit in the front row and just look at you, and he was so proud of you.
Well, he loved you. He just so loved. We had such wonderful discussions when we were driving the almost hour back home and in the week. But it just so happens that last night I was with my son Kinsey, and we try to have dinner and watch a movie on Saturdays. It's the only time I get together with someone else. And this particular movie we were watching had a part in it about a woman whose husband had died a year before. And it just would suddenly hit her at times and she would just sit there and cry. And I turned to Kinsey, and he knows this because we've talked about it lots of times before. He didn't get to know my father. My father died 3 years before Kinsey was born. But anyway, I said to Kinsey, Carl's been gone now almost 12 years, but I know exactly how that woman feels still, because obviously I have continued to function all these years in much the same way I did. But there are just moments that happen that I'm so reminded of him. Something I read, something I hear, a song, just so many things. And I don't have a lot of breakdown moments, but I do have lots of thoughts that go through my head. And I don't know that they're ever going to stop. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So I appreciate that you are giving us, in a way, your brand of permission to mourn in our own time and in our own way. So thank you again. It was wonderful. So look forward to hearing and seeing you in the very near future.
Thanks, friend.
And we have Luke. Go ahead, Luke.
Hello. I got a question. So you said that mourning is a communal thing, and how can we, during this state of quarantine, how can we mourn in the community? Like, what's some ways we can overcome that?
Right. It's a really good question, and a number of people have managed to do it. Most recently, I found it interesting what they're doing in Nova Scotia following this mass murder that they just had. We can't go to cemeteries. We can't go to funeral homes. We can't sit Shiva because we can't visit people. So technology helps. A number of people have started writing letters. I mean, actual letters as opposed to email, and letting the mail do this. So you actually hold something in your hand, which has more of a comforting sense than if it comes in on the screen because it's tangible, it's palpable. People are doing artworks in memory of and collages as best they can, because and then you bring folks together that way. I have a very dear friend in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, who right after they went into quarantine. She got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and her friends can't visit her. And she's decided she didn't want to go into hospice because at least if she's in her own house, she can be with her husband and she can be with her daughters. And she's asked people to send photographs. And that's become helpful, not only for her, but also for her family. Oh, remember when we were all together. And the photographs carry those memories as well. If you know people are praying at the certain time that you're praying, or coming together at a certain time, I have one group of friends that did a song all together in memory of a deceased person. I mean, they're all in New York and that's what they do. So they all zoomed in together and they all sang a song together. It sort of worked. So part of it is, it's the new normal. And then what do you do? And what works for one person might not work for another. What works for people of your generation is, it doesn't work as well for people in my generation, because we're still trying to figure out how to turn the computer on. So there it's bringing generations together when the younger people are helping the older people generally. How do you do this with technology? And the old prayers, they still work. The old hymns, they still work. And when you come together like this, so I can see some of you because I've got Zoom screen. I can't see you all at the same time, but I can see a number of you. We're all in this together. And in a weird way, this is final comment because it's almost noon. It was like, I've been teaching since March 9th on Zoom because that's when we shut down. I can actually see you better than I can if we're in a room together, because you're all directly in front of me. So I don't have to turn this way or worried about people behind me or worried about people coming in the door. So what Zoom does in a very strange way is create a better community, because people's faces, if you're on, we can actually see your faces together, and we can see this more than if we're sitting there just one-on-one. And that becomes a form of mourning as well, because it's a new way of creating community. For me personally, I like the cards. I like the handwritten whatever. I mean, you download the thing from your computer and all you have to do is get it into the mailbox, and God bless the post office, they're still working. I find that really helpful, and that leaves you something at the end. Flowers will die, a card will stay, a donation in the memory of someone will stay, which is traditional in Judaism. We don't send flowers, we make donations. Oh, here's a donation to a scholarship fund that this person cared about. Here's a donation to oh gosh, it's GNUUC, send something to the ACLU, or for separation of church and state, because you know that person will care, and that money is for that person's memory. And on we go.
Thank you so much. We love interactive services. That's our favorite. So we've really enjoyed that today. And now let's listen and sing with Fran as she shares hymn 1022, Comfort Me.
Comfort me, oh my soul. Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Sing with me, sing with me, sing with me, oh my soul. Sing with me, sing with me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul. Comfort me, comfort me, comfort me, oh my soul.
This is our time for joys and concerns. I'm going to suggest that we keep them very brief, and then we can continue with more joys and concerns during our coffee time. So Jesse will lead us now in joys and concerns.
If anyone has a joy or concern that's particularly on their mind this week, please raise your hand. I can unmute you. And then Karen, who is at GNUUC right now, will light a candle for you. So please raise your hand if there's something you would like to share. Susan.
So I wanted to share with Reverend Cynthia that the bird seed that she sent to Lex got into a feeder that he made and is feeding some baby blue jays that have a nest right by our door.
Thank you, Susan. I light a candle for your joy and for Lex.
Charles.
I'd like to light a candle in memory of Ed Dorr, E-D-D-D-O-E-R-R, who was the director of the Americans for Religious Liberty and a prominent figure in Unitarianism and the American Humanist Association, and author of a lot of books and articles about religious liberty.
Thank you, Charles. I light a candle for your loss, for your remembrance.
Sandy.
Yes.
Oh. And Sandy, just one moment, if you can have Larry turn his sound all the way down.
Okay, I have a joy, and that's lost skills that I'm attaining once more. I haven't sewn this much since I was very young in home ec, and I'm getting comfortable with that. I'm also cooking more, and I hadn't done that in years either, except just occasionally, and I feel the need to do that quite a bit. So those skills you think you have lost over time, this is bringing them out. That's a positive thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. I light a candle for your joy.
Are there any other joys or concerns among those? Yes, I see Nancy.
I just want to light a candle for the U.S. Postal Service. On, I think it was Wednesday, I had a package of mask making materials that I wanted to mail to my sister so she could make her own masks. And the envelope was a little thick, so, and I didn't want to go inside the office, so I thought I'll just put it in the box outside. Well, they don't make the box so that you can open the door anymore, so there was a very narrow slot, and the envelope didn't really want to go in, so I tried to reposition it, and as I did that, some kind of claw in there grabbed it and cut a big gash in the envelope. Well, I had got an email. I finally got it into the box after much frustration. And I got an email from my sister yesterday saying, it was kind of like a big question mark. Like, what is this? And but it turned out that somebody, some post office employee, took the envelope and put a nice piece of tape on it so that she did get the package. First, she got it really fast, and it was intact, and I was so impressed.
Thank you, Nancy. I light a candle for your joy.
I'll take a moment to, are there any other joys and concerns among those with video? Oh, Marge.
I'd like to light a candle for AJ in the loss of her friend.
Thank you, Marge. Light a candle in remembrance of AJ's friends.
I will go ahead and unmute those on phones and see if there are any joys and concerns that you would like to share. All right.
Jesse?
Yes.
Hi. I have a candle to light. First, a candle for the mural that AJ referenced in her service. And second, the candle for my sister joining the service, visiting from Gainesville, Florida. Hi, Lisa. It is so nice to have you here.
And Karen, if you could light one final candle.
Light this candle for all the joys and concerns in our hearts, but not shared with us right now.
As we reflect on what we've heard, let's sing together hymn number 123, Spirit of Life. Please join me in saying the words of our chalice extinguishing. May the love which overcomes all differences, which heals all wounds, which puts to flight all fears, which reconciles all who are separated, be in and among us now and always. These are our closing words. From all who now are leaving here, let highest thoughts and hopes arise. Let truth's majestic power be sung, and goodness reign in all our lives. We have several announcements today. The first one is from Mary Hinton. She would like for us to remember that today we would normally be giving final details for the annual church retreat, which was scheduled for next weekend. She says, think this week about the packing for camp that you do not have to do, and enjoy memories of all the wonderful people and fun that have made our retreat so special. Aren't we lucky to have had all of that? Now, Jesse has an announcement for us about the pledge drive.
Thank you, Denise. And thank you, everyone who has contributed to Greater Nashville Unitarian Universalist Congregation in the past. And I say thank you because of you, our congregation is strong when we need it most. Our minister and pastoral support team are providing emotional and social support. Volunteers are running errands and delivering food. Members are making masks and sharing the know-how of making masks with others. We help one another with technical issues so we can stay connected. And every Sunday, we're able to be together and to find a connection and to take solace. And it's all because you contributed. So later on this afternoon, we're going to be emailing a request to support us again in this coming fiscal year. And it's a time that we recognize is uncertain for many people. And so what we ask is that you consider, if you are able, to contribute more for those who are only able to contribute less. Our world's been tremendously altered, and many of us and many of our friends are facing struggles and uncertainty. So pledge what you can, and know that if your circumstances change, that you can change your pledge at a later time. So if you would, be on the lookout in your email for an email from GNUUC. It should be coming directly from me, jesse.spencersmith@gnuuc.org. And there'll be a letter in there asking for your support, and also a link for you to support us by filling out an online pledge card. And there's a link right there in the email. We've also attached to the email all the contributions you've made in the past year and the pledge that you made in previous year, just for your information. But if you have any questions, if you need more information or would like to have any guidance, please feel free to email me, jesse.spencersmith@gnuuc.org, or kristenreveal@gnuuc.org. All the information will be in the emails. And again, thank you for supporting our congregation and for making this community possible.
Our last announcement is an invitation to everyone to stay online for conversation during our coffee time. Jesse will unmute us all so that we can speak up and speak out.
Okay, unmute all.
Except Donna, that's all. Okay, babe.
Oh, there she is.
It's still recording.